Hotel family. Welcome back to the Chosen Few channel. Y'all saw the title. Today we're going to be talking about Colonial Wear, from Africa to America, ancient pottery style, Dave the Potter, and more. That's right. Today I'm going to be talking about Colonial Wear. Now, what exactly is Colonial Wear? First off, we have to understand that several hundred years ago, something interesting happened. Three distinct groups were forced into a living situation that changed the history of all three groups. And the three groups that I'm talking about are the West and Central Africans who were brought to the Americas enslaved, the natives to the Americas, and the colonizing Europeans who came to America. Now, I always like to talk to you guys about history, and I primarily like to focus on written history, the real bookworm. But history isn't always written like in words in books on paper. Sometimes history is written within the archaeological record, and buried within the archaeological record, we can read or we can see history unfolding, and we can get a better understanding of why the reality that we are in is the reality that we are in. So, what is colonial wear, family? First off, before I show you guys this video, what is colonial wear? Real quick. Colonial wear, which is alternately called colonial Indian wear, is a type of earthenware created by African Americans along the Atlantic coast, ranging north and south from Delaware and Florida, and as far west as Tennessee and Kentucky during the colonial era in America. So it's called colonial wear because they're identifying it with the period of colonialism. Look where it says with the history. In Charleston, South Carolina, 13 colonial wear from the 18th century were found with folded strips. Now, mind you, the 18th century is from 1700 to 1800. That's the 18th century. So it's 17 something, 1730, 1740, 1755. It's something like that. 13 colonial wear from the 18th century were found with folded strip roulette decorations. From the time of colonial America until the 19th century in the United States, African Americans and their enslaved African ancestors, as well as the Native Americans who were enslaved and not enslaved, were creating colonial wear of this pottery style. Now check this out, family. What you have to understand is when these three groups encountered one another, a certain form of pottery making developed, which was influenced by all three different groups. So this video that I'm going to show you guys is going to highlight some of the things that these different groups uh, um, 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 added to or gave to the creation of what we're calling colonial wear. And they're really going to dig in deep when they tie into the African connection, because they're going to show you based on some other archaeological sites of where in Africa, just stay tuned, where in Africa this particular style that we find in on plantations in North America, where this particular style likely came from. Let's get to the video, and I want you to see and listen to the people who the archaeologists, the researchers who actually worked on this and uncovered the information that we know about this stuff. Remember, colonial wear from Africa to America, ancient pottery style, Dave the Potter, and more.
Hello and welcome. I'm Heather Hodges, the Executive Director of the Gullagiti Cultural Heritage Corridor. The corridor is a federal national heritage area established by an act of Congress in 2006 to recognize the unique contributions of the Gullagiti people who have traditionally lived in the coastal areas and on the Sea Islands of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, from Pender County, North Carolina to St. Johns County, Florida. All across the Gullagiti Cultural Heritage Corridor today, you'll find historic and vibrant Gullagiti communities, and we encourage you to visit them, as well as one of our many heritage sites to learn more about this rich history and culture. We also encourage you to attend one of the many educational programs that we offer year round across the corridor, programs like the one that you're going to view today. We hope that you'll walk away from this program with a deeper understanding of the historic experience of enslaved Africans in colonial South Carolina. After the program is finished, we hope that you'll visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter so that you can be kept up to date on all of our upcoming events and programs. Last, I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Clemson University and College of Charleston Graduate Program in Historic Preservation and the Charleston County Public Library for collaborating with us to bring you this program today. I also thank you for your enduring interest in learning more about the history and culture of the Gullagiti people, and I look forward to meeting you in the corridor one day soon.
Shout out to the Gullagiti, man. Shout out to the Gullagiti.
Hello, my name is John Marcoux, and I'm the director of the Clemson.
Real quick, do anybody out there that's watching this leave a comment? Do anyone out here have any type of connection to the Gullagiti? If so, leave a comment. I'd be interested to hear about that. Thank you.
College of Charleston Graduate Program in Historic Preservation. I'm also an Hello, my name is John Marcoux, and I'm the director of the Clemson College of Charleston Graduate Program in Historic Preservation. I'm also an archaeologist and a professor of anthropology.
And I'm Corey Hayward, Wexler Curatorial Fellow and archaeologist at Drayton Hall. And John and I would like to share with you guys today some of the research that we've been doing for the past year on Colonoware. Colonoware is a type of pottery that was made by Native Americans and enslaved Africans and their descendants beginning in colonial America and into the 19th century. This ceramic type is found at nearly all historic sites in the U.S., and the appearance of the vessels vary greatly depending on where it was made. For example, Colonoware in Virginia is found at sites more greatly associated with Native American groups. But down here in South Carolina, most Colonoware was recovered archaeologically from sites inhabited by enslaved Africans and African Americans. Colonoware is a unique and important artifact type because it shows influences from multiple cultural groups.
Hold on just a second. Hold on just a second. We're going to get right back into that, family. Right back into that.
During the colonial period, Europeans forced Africans and Native Americans together, and as interactions increased between all three of these groups, they inevitably exchanged ideas, and in this case, pottery making traditions.
See, that's exactly what I said. So these three came together. These three distinct groups came together during colonialism, shared ideas, and things things in the archaeological record was created from that. Some of that is this colonial wear. Let's see how deep it goes.
Not only can we see the changes in ways colonial pots were made, but new vessel forms previously unseen in both African and Native American traditions also were made in order to cater to a more European market.
So these practices are being used to create something new. Is what they're saying. Yes, there's influence from the Native Americans. Yes, there's influence from West Central Africa. Yes, there's influence from colonialism from Europeans and Britain and things like that. But this is also something that is taking these influences and actually creating something new.
Archaeologists use the term Colonoware to describe this type of pottery to reflect the fact that it is a product of colonialism. Colonoware pottery would not be made if it were not for the colonial project of Europeans in North America. One of the questions that archaeologists are really engaged with is trying to look at colonoware as a marker of the identities that are being created during the colonial period, especially among the makers of this pottery, which is primarily enslaved Africans and Native Americans.
Pause. So did y'all hear that? His angle. Now this is like, he's one of these archaeologists that's working with this pottery. but part of his research is looking into this as an identifier of a people group that is being created, a people group that is being created by this process of colonialism, a people group that, yes, has ties historically to other people groups, but now because of a certain situation has created a distinct people group from the parent people groups that it shares history with. I'm gonna go back just a little bit and let y'all hear what he say again. This is his perspective on this. Listen.
Is trying to look at Colonoware as a marker of the identities that are being created during the colonial period, especially among the makers. One of the questions that archaeologists are really engaged with is trying to look at Colonoware as a marker of the identities that are being created during the colonial period.
He says this is one of the questions that they are really looking into, that archaeologists are really looking into. And when he says he don't say the identity, he say the identities. I noticed that. Let's look at what is he trying to say? Look into the identities that are being created. But I will say I have thought about that whole concept of, a new people. Well, what does that what does that mean? What does that entail? Are we a new people, distinct? Yes, we have our ancestors, but what we have went through is, is it a new time, or what's really going on? New people. What is he talking about? And is there any legitimacy to what he's talking about?
Of Europeans in North America. One of the questions that archaeologists are really engaged with is trying to look at Colonoware as a marker of the identities that are being created during the colonial period, especially among the makers of this pottery, which is primarily enslaved Africans and Native Americans. I'd like to, for the next couple minutes, talk about the potting traditions of local Native Americans, because as part of our project, archaeologists like to look backward to see where the traditions came from that might be contributing to the Colonoware we find in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we can begin by thinking about the archaeological finds made around the Charleston Harbor that reflect life of Native American communities in the 16th and 17th centuries, just prior to and during the first few decades of European colonialism in the area. Archaeologists refer to this period as the Ashley period, and it runs from approximately AD 1550 to 7.
Are we a new people? I'm just gonna ask the question. I'm not saying yes or no. I want to know what y'all think. I gotta ask the question since this archaeologist, since this guy brought it up. Are we a new people?
1700 or so. In this map, we can see the locations of some of the archaeological sites where we find pottery from Native American communities dating to this period. And generally, the presence of this pottery at these sites reflects either interactions between a European settlement, such as the Lord Ashley site, or Drayton Hall, the interaction between the Europeans living there and Native Americans who were either trading at the site or were enslaved at the site. The other types of sites we find are the actual villages where Native Americans lived during this period. And as you can see, there's not a ton of archaeological sites. Part of this is the fact that they were relatively small. And another part is that this was not a very populous region when the Europeans arrived. When we think about the pottery styles that Native American groups made during this time period, we refer to a larger potting tradition that was practiced by many Native American groups in the region. Archaeologists refer to this archaeological manifestation of potting traditions as the Lamar culture, which, as you can see in the map, spanned all the way from North Carolina to eastern Alabama, south to northwestern Florida. and even crept into East Tennessee a little bit. This is not the equivalent of what we would think of as a modern tribe. In fact, there's a lot of cultural variability among groups in this culture area, the Lamar culture, but they did share a very similar potting tradition that had very distinctive decorations and vessel forms. Generally, the Ashley period potters decorated their pottery in a couple of different ways. The primary method of decoration that was used involved carved wooden paddles. So the potter would take a sharp implement, most likely made of stone, and would carve complex decorations, either curving lines or intersecting straight lines, into the paddle. And then as the potter constructed the vessel, by usually taking coils of clay and winding them around, and then taking a paddle and some sort of, usually a rock or even their hand on the inside of the vessel, in order to weld or anneal those coils together. At the very end of forming the pot, they could impress the pot with this carved wooden paddle to leave intricate stamped impressions. Potters also would take sharp instruments and draw in the sides of vessels. Now, this would be when the vessels are wet, of course, and this is called incising. And these are the two primary forms of decoration in what we would think of as Ashley period pottery assemblages. Intricate designs could include curvilinear designs like concentric circles or bullseyes, or sort of sweeping scrolls, figure eights or nines, as well as zigzagging rectilinear shapes, straight lines, or what we would call line block, which are intersecting at right angle lines. Potters would also decorate the rims of vessels by punctating or poking the rim with a hollow reed, or sometimes they would attach a strip of clay to the rim and then notch it with a stick, leaving a very sort of a nice decoration along the lip of the vessel. One of the interesting things when you look at these decorative motifs is that they look very little like Colonial Wear that's found on low country sites on the plantations. Colonial Wear is never really stamped like these vessels. Very rarely is it incised with anything more than a couple of lines, usually intersecting lines. And the vessel forms also of Colonial Wear on 18th century plantations do not really mimic the forms that we typically find on early Native American sites dating to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Colonial Wear bowls tend to be relatively shallow, whereas the Native American bowls tend to be relatively deep. The jars on Native American villages tend to be opened, meaning they don't really have a tight constriction or a mouth at any one time. They almost are like very deep bowls with excurvate rims, whereas Colonial Wear jars tend to have a definite, what we would call a mouth on them, or a constriction where the vessel comes into a narrow spot and then opens back up to the rim. So this, again, is a very interesting indication of that colonial influence. So Colonial Wear really is, in its true sense, a colonial piece of material culture. You can think of it as springing out of the interaction of these different cultural groups of Europeans, enslaved Africans, and enslaved and free Native Americans. You can think of it as what anthropologists would call ethnogenesis, or the creation of a new cultural practice out of constituent practices, meaning the potting traditions of enslaved.
Wait, I want to point something out. Y'all heard what he just said? He brought it up again, but this time he used a real interesting word: ethnogenesis. Listen to this.
Anthropologists would call ethnogenesis, or the
Someone's out here white.
interaction of these different cultural groups of Europeans, enslaved Africans, and enslaved and free Native Americans. You can think of it as what anthropologists would call ethnogenesis, or the creation of a new cultural practice.
Boom. So he says this is what they anthropologists would call ethnogenesis, or the creation of new cultural practices, right? But check this out. I want to show y'all exactly what ethnogenesis means. You may already know, you may already have an idea, but let's just read it and try to see if this means anything in relation to what he was saying earlier. Look at this. Ethnogenesis is the formation and development of an ethnic group. That's the first sentence on here. And also there's a group of people, like the word from Greek means a group of people. Is the formation and development of an ethnic group. This can originate by group self-identification or by outside identification. The term ethnogenesis was originally a mid-19th century neologism that was later introduced into 20th century academic anthropology. In that context, it refers to the observable phenomenon of the emergence of new social groups that are identified as having a cohesive identity, i.e., an ethnic group in anthropological terms. Relevant social sciences not only observe this phenomenon, but search for explanation of its causes. The term ethnogeny is also used as a variant of ethnogenesis. So he's talking about the creation of an ethnic group. And a little while ago, remember I paused and I told y'all when he was talking about this colonial wear, he's saying this colonial wear is a physical marker of the creation of a new ethnic identity. And he is primarily talking about a new ethnic identity of the main people that this colonial wear is found among, the quote unquote African Americans or the enslaved Africans, saying that from what happened with colonialism and coming from Africa and being mixed and mingled with the Europeans and the Indians, and these cultures coming together, a new ethnic group was formed amongst quote unquote black people or African Americans or the enslaved ancestors. Right. And he's saying that what he's trying to present is that a physical archaeological record of that or tangible evidence of that is this colonial wear. The colonial wear itself illustrates ethnogenesis. Right. But let's get back to that video. Okay, here we go.
Out of you can think of it as springing out of to the rim. So this again is a very interesting indication of that colonial influence. So colonial wear really is, in its true sense, a colonial piece of material culture. You can think of it as springing out of the interaction of these different cultural groups of Europeans, enslaved Africans, and enslaved and free Native Americans. You can think of it as what anthropologists would call ethnogenesis, or the creation of a new cultural practice out of constituent practices, meaning the potting traditions of enslaved Africans and of Native Americans came together to create this new form, which becomes very common. It becomes a very common part of the tools and the daily lives of enslaved people on these plantations.
Because Colonoware was made by marginalized groups during the colonial period, we have nearly no documentary evidence to help us research who was making Colonoware, how they were doing this, and why.
Let me run that back. That may be true, but let me run that back.
Because Colonoware was made by marginalized groups during the colonial period, we have nearly no documentary evidence to help us research who was making Colonoware, how they were doing this, and why. Because Colonoware was made by marginalized groups during the colonial period, we have nearly no documentary evidence to help us research who was making Colonoware, how they were doing this, and why.
That may be true. Like I said a second ago, that may be true. But we do have an enslaved ancestor who we can highlight. May his name live on forever and may his memory never die. Dave the Potter, right? David Drake, may his name live on forever and may his memory never die. We can highlight him, and under him, we can categorize and lay in place all of the others. Because if we have one to highlight, we have one to look to who could be a representative for all of the countless nameless others who we do not have a record of. So allow me to introduce you guys to Dave the Potter, right? Dave the Potter or David Drake. Now this is a New York Times article. It says the enslaved artist whose pottery was an act of resistance. The enslaved artist whose pottery was an act of resistance. Poetic jars by David Drake are setting records at auction and starring in art museums, showcasing the artistry of enslaved African Americans. There is an ancestor who was creating pottery while enslaved, and we know his name, we know some of his history, and he actually was writing on the pottery, not only signing his name, but he was writing poetry on there, and he was using his artistry of the creating the pottery and his ability to write and his intelligence to rebel and resist against unjust laws. Y'all look at this. What you're looking at right now, the stone War Cantonation Jar. Hold on. The Stoneware Cantonation Jar by David Drake from 1836, bought at auction for $369,000. So one of the enslaved ancestors, Dave the Potter, one of his jars just sold for $369,000. Now, why is it called the Cantonation Jar, family? It says, across the shoulder runs one word that Drake inscribed with a sharpened stick or similar tool. Cantonation, a variant of cantonation with an E. The state of being yoked or chained. Just as notable, experts said that the jar is dated 12 April 1836, 2 years after South Carolina passed an especially punitive anti-literacy law designed to prevent slaves from writing, making this single word an extraordinary act of resistance or defiance by Drake. So I want y'all to see something, family. Look at this. You're looking at the jar. You see that word? Look where the hand is moving. That's the C. Cantonation. Now, cantonation is like the state of being connected or chained or physically yoked. Now, he did this 2 years after they passed the anti-literacy law in South Carolina in 1836, and so he wasn't even supposed to be writing, right? But he did write, and when he wrote, he was expressing his disdain. His disdain for that law. It was an act of resistance, act of rebellion. It was an act of standing up and standing firm. And now that jar sold for $369,000, family. He has more. Like I said, he didn't only just sign his name, he didn't only resist, but he wrote like poetry and statements. This jar on the left is inscribed with his name right here. You see where the hand is moving? Dave. He inscribed his name on this one. The one on the right, from 1857, it's inscribed with his name right here, Dave. But you see over his name, Dave, it's like a whole sentence. That says, I made this jar for cash, though it's called lucre trash. Remember, he also wrote poems on there. So he says he made this jar for cash, though it's called lucre cash. I don't understand what that means, but may his name live on forever and may his memory never die. Check this one out. You can see in the bottom right hand corner, here's his name, Dave. And above it, he says, when you fill this jar, and it goes on to say, when you fill this jar with pork or beef, Scott will be there to get a piece. Look over here on the left side. That's Scott. Scott will be there too. And it goes on to say, get his piece. Look at this one, family. Beautiful work, though. Look at that glaze. He signs his name on this one as well, but the words, he says, I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all in every nation. Powerful words. Powerful words by the ancestor, man. His name live on forever and may his memory never die. So while the lady was technically correct, right? She was correct. We do know the name of that particular ancestor, Dave the Potter. And so what we will do, we will highlight and we will revere Dave the Potter, and he will be a representative for the ones that we do not know. And as we learn other names, we will highlight those names and add them to the list with Dave the Potter, and it will grow and grow and grow and grow. May your name live on forever. May your memory never die. Colonial Wear, from Africa to America, ancient pottery style, Dave the Potter, and more. Y'all go to dandyandbigherm.com or courtfigure.com and support what the Real Bookworm got going on. Support the channel, The Chosen Few channel, and go and purchase one of my 4 novels, Suicide Note, Thicker Than Water. Those are 2 urban fiction novels. Big Game Hunting, the most revolutionary book, all true that you want to hear. How me and my brother took on these dirty cops and dirty, crooked, corrupt politicians in my area, and my beautiful and loving wife. The greatest love story ever lived and the greatest love story ever told about my relationship with my wife, and my suggestion to my descendants for 1,000 years on how they should treat their wives and how they should engage in a relationship. Right? Because just like Dave, I want my name to live for 1,000 years, family. Let's get back to the video.
Because Colonoware was made by marginalized groups during the colonial period, we have nearly no documentary evidence to help us research who was making Colonoware, how they were doing this, and why. Unlike with European and European American ceramics, the production of which was heavily documented, Colonoware is still kind of a mystery. Therefore, in order to understand how and why Colonoware was made, we as archaeologists look at the different physical attributes or characteristics that make up a pottery vessel. For example, we study things like the types of clay used and how potters cleaned and prepared this clay. We also look at how the vessel was formed, whether it was made by coiling or slab building, what kind of shape or form the potter wanted, and of course the various surface treatments and decorations. All of these attributes represent a specific choice made by the potter, and that is essentially what we are trying to understand, the human behind the artifact. While in most cases it is difficult to determine the ethnicity of a potter based off of the physical characteristics of a vessel alone, my colleagues and I have identified a handful of colonial shards that bear a rare and specific type of surface decoration with direct ties to West and Northern Central Africa. About a year ago, Martha Zierden from the Charleston Museum got in touch with John and me about 4 sherds with an impression that none of us had seen before. These were from the Hayward Washington House, located on Church Street in downtown Charleston, and all of these sherds appeared to have been broken from the same vessel. It was soon after that I realized Drayton Hall's collection contained 9 very similar sherds.
All right, pay attention. All right, pay attention to that part right there, to that design, because that design, upon their further research, that design is what's going to crack the code. Okay.
Charleston Museum got in touch with John and me about 4 sherds with an impression that none of us had seen before. These were from the Hayward Washington House, located on Church Street in downtown Charleston, and all of these sherds appeared to have been broken from the same vessel. It was soon after that I realized Drayton Hall's collection contained 9 very similar sherds, all from a well feature that had been used as a trash pit. Similarly, these all seemed to have come from the same vessel, and they had the same unidentified impression. Finally, just a couple months ago, while John and I were in Conway for the International Gullagiti in African Diaspora Conference, we came across a large Colonoware pot in the Horry County Museum that had the same impression. The impression visible on all of these vessels consists of Z-shaped grooves resulting in repeating asymmetrical diamond-like shapes in relief. While the 3 vessels we have identified are not exactly identical, some have larger impressions or the clay appeared more wet at the time of decoration, they seem to have been made using the same technique. After some digging, John figured out that the impressions were made using a technique called rouletting. A roulette can be any object that is rolled across the surface of a pot, thus creating a repeating pattern. It was a fairly common decorative technique, having been used in many different pottery decorating traditions through time, including today. John was able to identify the particular type of roulette used on the Colonoware shirts. This is called a folded strip roulette, a pottery decorating tool that has been used in West and Northern Central Africa for over 2,000.
Okay, so they noticed a particular type of rouletting design on the pottery on plantations, right? And so then they discovered what type of rouletting that was step by step. They are unfolding the mystery. They are going back in time and they are piecing this thing together. And so the more information that they uncover, the more of the picture that they will be able to see. Remember, history isn't always written down. History isn't always in books. History is also in the archaeological record. Colonial Wear, from Africa to America, ancient pottery style, Dave the Potter, and more. The better your understanding of history is, the better your understanding of your position in this present world, and the better your understanding of what your actions, the effect your actions will have on the future. That's my opinion. And I believe that that's the opinion of a lot of you as well. I think that's why y'all keep going back, coming back. Y'all have to like a lot of the same stuff that I like, history.
1,000 years. A folded strip roulette is characterized by two or more flexible strips of material that has been used in wedding traditions through time, including today. John was able to identify the particular type of roulette used on the Colonoware shirts. This is called a folded strip roulette, a pottery decorating tool that has been used in West and Northern Central Africa for over 2,000 years. A folded strip roulette is characterized
Used in West and Central Africa for over 2,000 years. That's literally several thousand-year-old tradition found on a plantation. The knowledge, the tradition, the culture transmitted down not only thousands of years, but across the shores of the Atlantic, right? And even in North America, this super ancient tradition still carried over. That's amazing, man. That's amazing.
by two or more flexible strips of material, usually something vegetal. I used palm fronds here. And these strips are twisted and folded together, kind of like a lanyard, in order to create a three-sided tool. Then, when this tool is rolled across the surface of a vessel, it creates the same asymmetrical diamond-like shapes that repeat every third row. In fact, we can see that repeating pattern on the Colonoware shirts found at sites in Charleston. The distance between each third impression is consistent. This makes it unlikely that these shirts were impressed with fabric or net, which would have created more inconsistent impressions. John discovered a lot of previous archaeological and ethnographic studies in West and Northern Central Africa on folded strip roulettes, and the descriptions from these sources helped us replicate the tool and understand the steps that went into producing this decoration. Not only were these sources important for us identifying the impressions on these Colonoware shirts and how they were made, but they were also important for us understanding the context and history behind folded strip rouletting.
When we think about any possible connection of the rouletted specimens of pottery we recovered with potential African potting traditions, we rely on the work of archaeologists that have been researching groups in West and West Central Africa for the past 30 or 40 years or so. And we are very lucky in the last 10 years, a number of publications have come out that really document in detail the types of rouletted pottery that African potters are making currently and have been making for the last 1,000 years or so. So we rely heavily on the images and the ethnographic examples that are provided by these researchers. This research identifies a number of different types of rouletted designs that African potters in West and West Central Africa were making. The roulettes typically include roulettes either made of fiber of some sort, whether it's twined rope or cordage, or plated sort of vegetable matter like a palm frond, or they're carved wooden roulettes. And in these images, you can see examples from modern potters. On the right is the example of the roulette that's actually used, and on the left is an example of the impression that's left by that roulette after you roll it over the surface of the clay. And so you can see there's a variety of either carved wooden, there's even a shell that's used in one case. And then the fiber roulettes tend to be either braided or folded in some sort of way. The left side in the center looks as close to the type of roulette that we've recovered from the Charleston contexts. Research by Africanist archaeologist Alexander Livingstone Smith has charted the distribution of these different types of roulettes across different groups in Africa, both archaeologically and in the present, what we call ethnographically. And most of the potting tradition seems to be confined to the area that we know as the Sahel, running all the way from the Atlantic coast to the area around Lake Chad. And what you can see here is a relatively, nowadays anyway, a relatively discrete or different distribution of roulettes made of fiber, which is the darker gray, and then carved wooden roulettes, which tends to be, which is represented as the lighter color in this map. Looking back through time archaeologically, this map shows the distribution of the different types, the fiber and the carved wooden roulettes across that same area in the last 1,000 years. And what we can see is that the distribution was much less discrete. There was a lot more mixing. A lot more of the communities potters in the communities were actually using both fiber and carved wooden roulettes. One area, or two areas actually, to sort of keep in mind are the northwestern area of the shaded zone, as well as the southeastern around Lake Chad. These are two areas that largely were limited to just fiber roulettes, and this actually plays into two potential sources of the potting tradition that made the kind of roulette that we've recovered in the Low Country. Corey and I have looked at the literature of archaeologists working in West and West Central Africa and created this map showing the distribution of the particular type of roulette that we've recovered, which is known as a folded strip roulette, which is, of course, a very diagnostic type of rouletting. And by mining the work of other folks, the literature, we've identified a few kind of hot spots in West and West Central Africa where we see this type of rouletting. And we can see that if we look at current within the last.
So now he's finna say that based on the research, they've identified some places. He's going to say two specific places where the rouletting scene in North America that they have been talking about actually came from. Now, it may be impossible to pinpoint a specific spot with 100% accurate, but if you can back up your hypothesis with evidence, then your opinion, your hypothesis, your idea of where this style originated is just as valid as anybody else's, and is definitely more valid than anybody that don't got no reason to back up why they saying what they're saying.
Last 100 years or so, African potters in Senegal Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Sudan are still making pottery decorated with this type of roulette. And if we go back in time and look at archaeological context stretching from the last 2,000 years or so, we see this type of rouletting used in Mauritania and Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. And within this area, there's actually two really good candidates for potential sources of the potting tradition that may have ended up in the Low Country. Both of these areas were involved in the Atlantic slave trade during the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. The first area that is a candidate for the source of the potting tradition lies.
So this potting tradition was seen in America amongst enslaved Africans in the 1700s. And so he's going to highlight some key areas where this style was taking place at in Africa that was heavily involved in the slave trade.
Along the western shore of Lake Chad during the last 18th and early 19th tradition that may have used in Mauritania and Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. And within this area, there's actually two really good candidates for potential sources of the potting tradition that may have ended up in the Low Country. Both of these areas were involved in the Atlantic slave trade during the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. The first area that is a candidate for the source of the potting tradition lies along the western shore of Lake Chad. During the last 1,000 years or so, this area is part of what is known as the Kanem-Borno Empire. These were Islamic Kanuri-speaking Africans that controlled a large portion of that central western side of Lake Chad. And one of their main sources of income was enslaving and selling people from groups living to the south of Lake Chad. Two archaeological sites that have been excavated in recent years contain deposits that date to the 18th and 19th centuries. And these sites are associated with the Kanem-Borno Empire. The site to the north, Gawrumele, is thought to actually have been the capital of the Kanem-Borno Empire for a brief period during this time. This is not to say that these sites are where the potential potter making the pottery in the Low Country could have been from. In fact, potters from all over the Kanem-Borno Empire.
So he basically said that the Kanem-Borno Empire, an Islamic empire, was heavily involved in the slave trade, and they were enslaving people. That was one of the main sources of income for the empire, and they were having them shipped off to the Americas enslaved. And so the individuals responsible for the Colonial Wear may have been victims of this Islamic empire, is what he's saying. Not necessarily the real bookworm. I'm just letting y'all hear his information.
Most likely made pottery bearing this surface treatment. Another area that is a potential source of the folded strip roulette potting tradition lies about 400 kilometers to the west of Lake Chad. And this is an area that was settled by a different ethnic group of Africans who spoke the Hausa language. And the site of Kufan Kanawa is another recently excavated site that contains deposits from the right time period that would match up with the pottery that we've recovered in Low Country context. And potters in this region also made folded strip roulettes. Of course, we can never be sure the exact location of where the potters that made these vessels were from. We can only provide scenarios, potentials of where these potters may have come from. There is a lot of historical research that has yet to be done to demonstrate that we have potters from these groups. Typically, we think of enslaved Africans coming from along the coast because this is where the historical record typically picks up. We don't have a lot of historical documentation of the enslavement of people from much further east, even though it does the slave trade.
And that's true. But like I told y'all, history isn't only written. History isn't only in books. History is also in the archaeological record. Colonial Wear, from Africa to America, ancient pottery style, Dave the Potter, and more. If you want to show your support and get a banging book to read, go to one of the websites, dandyandbigherm.com or corefigure.com. Purchase one of those books. It's going to come signed from me and my brother. Hey, just support what we got going on, man. If you like the information, support the information, support the Real Bookworm, man. Hotel. Let's get back to this. Let me see.
Further east, even though it does the slave picks up. We don't have a lot of historical documentation of the enslavement of people from much further east, even though it does the slave trade did involve large numbers of people from this region. So in the future, archaeologists like my colleagues Corey and others and myself will need to really delve into the historic records that we have to try to see if there's additional evidence for this connection between the Low Country and these groups living around Lake Chad in West Central Africa.
Of course, we have a lot more research to do with rouletting and Colonoware as a whole, but one of our goals with this workshop was to bring this research out of the archaeology lab and to the Charleston community to get your thoughts. We also were planning on letting you try your own hand at making a roulette. I'm showing the full video here of me making a roulette in case anyone wants to try it. It is fairly simple. All you need are palm fronds. The key is to make sure that the strips don't fold into a crease. Instead, they need to create a cavity that will essentially result in that diamond-like shape in relief on the clay. I found that the thinner the strip, the easier it was to manipulate. In archaeology, we call this experimental archaeology, essentially attempting to replicate the processes or human behavior that resulted in the artifact or any other evidence appearing the way it does. With this particular study, it helped us understand the choices and skills that went into decorating the 3 vessels from Drayton Hall, the Hayward Washington House, and the Horry County Museum. For example, we learned that you can reuse a roulette over and over, but the impression it creates will appear slightly different because the way the vegetal materials dry out over time. So this kind of experiment, as well as understanding the full context of folded strip rouletting, helped us realize the importance of finding an African potting tradition, something very distinguishable from both Native American and European traditions retained in colonial America. John and I want to thank everyone for watching today. Like I said, we want to hear from you, any thoughts or questions that you may have. So please send them our way, and thanks again.
Okay, Colonial Wear, from Africa to America, ancient pottery style, Dave the Potter, and more. I hope y'all appreciate that presentation. I hope y'all appreciate that information. And like I said, if you want to show your support, you can go get one of those novels at one of the websites that's been going across your screen. This your brother Matthew Daniels, aka I'm Pooh, aka The Chosen Few, aka The Real Bookworm. But I'm not just a bookworm world, I'm the real bookworm. Make sure you get it right. And as always, may your name live on forever and may your memory never die. I'm out.